When you arrived at Auschwitz, the question was, who shall live and who shall die? You came off the train, there was what you call essentially, they divided men on one side, women on the other. They lined them up in groups of 5. Women and children went in on the right side, men went on the left side. And then they took them to a place which is, they took them to face selection. Selection, they made essentially the choice whether you were capable of working or not. When Enid arrived, she was young enough and strong enough to be picked to work. If you were picked to work, you then were sent to a place called the sauna, where they did in what we call Texas language, they essentially branded you and sheared you. They put a number on your arm, your number was your name, and they sheared you. They took off all of your hair, even from the most private of body parts. At that point, the question that was fortunate for her, she was asked the question, what did you do before you came to Auschwitz? And the answer she gave is, I played the cello. Now, remarkably enough, the Nazis had an orchestra at Auschwitz. And they had an orchestra that was really composed of very fine musicians. The orchestra used to stand at the entrance of the camp, right adjacent to the Arbeit macht frei, the work liberates sign. And they would play as prisoners were marching off to work. They would play as prisoners were marching back at work. It was a certain sense of macabre sense of humor in which they wanted the workers to come out and sometimes they made them march to the beat, and they hit those they whipped those who were not marching to the beat. But the question became that they saw a utility in musicians, and music made it easier for the killers to kill. And ironically, not only for the killers to kill, but for the killers to feel a certain sophistication and a certain type of cultural elan as they were doing their work. Camp life was horrible for everyone. Because they were useful, they had the possibility of living. And because they had the possibility of living, they also had the confidence that they might live for a time. Nobody had the confidence that they would live in the long run. They were treated slightly better, but understand that slightly better is not normally the way in which we treat fellow human beings. And they also had to do something that was enormously difficult, which is, especially for string instruments, that is play their string instruments in the dead of winter, in the cold, in the rain, in the snow. And they had to do so almost without the possibility of being warm. We use the word cold, it means we forgot to put a jacket on or a sweater. Prisoners got cold in October, they got warm again in May. We use the word hungry, which means I missed lunch and I'm ready for dinner. They ate in 1941, they ate again in 1945, and often when they ate again, it killed them. So when you say they had better conditions, yes, they had better conditions, but those conditions were horrific. They were a little bit less horrific than the ordinary prisoner, and a little bit more secure because they had an assigned task, and a task which the Nazis, for their own reasons, regarded as somewhat vital. I think.
Oh, no, thank you, sorry. Okay. That's the question good.
What purpose did the camp orchestra serve?
I think the camp orchestra served a very important purpose to the killers. It masked the magnitude of the evil they were doing. Jews arrived in Auschwitz from ghettos. They were told to pack a suitcase, 20 kilos, 25 kilos. Depending on who you were, you took things that were important to you. A religious Jew would take his talit and tefillin, his prayer shawl, and his phylacteries. An artist might take his brushes or might take his writing material. They're told they're being resettled in the East. A barber might even take his barber utensils, figuring that he could get a job in his new environment. A musician would take that which was most precious to them, which is their instrument. And because they took their instrument, the instruments arrived there. When they arrived, you were told to leave all your material behind, and they told them that they would get it back. Most of that material was taken to a place which was the barracks for sorting, massive barracks for sorting. It was called Canada because Canada is supposed to be a place of affluence. And if you went through Canada, you had all sorts of things that were important to the various people who arrived. You know, you brought things that we brought on every trip. You brought a toothbrush and a shaving razor. You brought You brought pictures of your family because you were closing out one life and beginning something, thinking that you were beginning something else. So you brought the pictures of your mother and father, of your brother and sister, of your son and daughter, of your wife. You brought all sorts of things with you, and what is the most important thing to a musician, aside from the human beings that they are engaged with and love, and very often even aside from them, the most important to them thing for them as a musician is to bring their instruments. You obviously couldn't bring a piano. You obviously couldn't bring a drum. You obviously couldn't bring anything that would not fit in your suitcase or in a special case. So consequently, musicians brought that which was important to them, their instruments, and in Anita's case, that saved her life.
What pressed?
They would face, members of the orchestra would face the same pressures as every other prisoner, but in a different way. They would face the pressures of living with the uncertainty of impending death. They would face the pressures of hunger and starvation. They would face the pressures of their performance, because if they slacked, if they weakened, if they couldn't go on, they were dead. They would face the pressure of seeing everybody go out to work, and you're standing there playing music, and seeing also when they returned that not everybody was returning. To live in Auschwitz was to live with the omnipresence of death all around you.
It's an incredible paradox.
Well, Joseph Mengele was a unique figure in Auschwitz. Joseph Mengele, you have to think of, he did the horrific medical experiments, but this was a man who had an MD and PhD degree. He was from a family that was famous throughout Germany because Mengele in Germany is the great tractor and farm equipment manufacturer, equivalent to what John Deere would be in the United States. And Mengele regarded himself as a man of distinction and sophistication with refined tastes. One of the paradoxes and the painful conclusions of the Holocaust is Germany was the most cultured, the most civilized, the most advanced of all societies. But culture and civilization is not equal to ethical behavior. And a man like Mengele could cry at music and could be dry-eyed as he murdered children. He could stand at the ramp deciding who shall live and who shall die without showing any emotion. He could even, and Mengele, when he worked with the children, they called him Uncle Mengele. He treated them well until they were no longer useful and they were then dead. So he could have the most refined taste, the best training in science, the most refined taste in music, and be an educated monster. The existence of a camp orchestra was not at odds with the dehumanization. It was an instrument of dehumanization. In virtually every camp, they have a camp orchestra. I worked on the camp of Belzec. Belzec had 500,000 Jews who were killed in 10 months, 2 known survivors. Only one of them lived to give testimony because the other one was shot on his way to the court to give testimony. And when the man Rudolf Redder gave testimony, he had worked in the Sonderkommando, bringing the bodies out bring the bodies out from the gas chamber into mass graves. And the statement that's most haunting that he says, and the orchestra played on and on. They played on from morning to night. So these men would be accompanied by beautiful music that would soothe the SS and that would show that one can appreciate music, therefore be a man or woman of culture, but still supervise a killing process that is murderous beyond belief.
Do you think music?
For some, they could never play again. And for others, music was their life. And consequently, you have to go back to that which gives your life purpose and meaning. And some musicians are passionate about their talent and their gift, and they have to play. That's who they are. So for some, they could never go back. And for others, after they recovered, they had to go back. That was who they were. There was a survivor who was a string instrument player, realized that he would not make it in the string section of the orchestra. So he said, I can play the cymbals. And what happened to him is he had never played a percussion instrument, never played the cymbals. So the first time he played the cymbals, he thought, how do you make sound with the cymbals? He had been in orchestras, he had heard the cymbals being played, had never really paid attention to how the cymbals were being played. So he took the cymbals and he struck them together, and then you had the pocket of air, and he thought that he had broken both his wrists and his arms were in terrible pain, and he had to learn how to strike the cymbals. And he later became part of the orchestra as a cymbal player. And to hear him tell the story, he said, you know, cymbal players are all important when they play the cymbals, but they have a lot of spare time in the orchestra. Who chose the music? Sometimes the Nazis asked that specific music be played. Sometimes the orchestra conductor was able to choose his own music. In certain places, the orchestra conductor tried to use music as a modality of embarrassing the Nazis. At Theresienstadt, which was a totally different camp than Auschwitz, because it wasn't really a death camp, but Theresienstadt was the place where Central Europeans of distinction were sent to because they might be asked for by men and women of influence in Germany and Austria. And there they had great conductors. Raphael Schachter was the conductor, and he chose to perform the Defiant Requiem, figuring that if he performed Verdi's Defiant Requiem, he'd be embarrassing the Nazi masters, because the Defiant Requiem is really about another Jew. Jesus was a Jew, and playing the Defiant Requiem while you're killing Jews and then remembering a Jew who was sacrificed in order to bring about atonement and cleansing, he thought might humiliate the Nazis. He performed it diligently and well, even when his orchestra and his choir was sent to their death. But the Nazis were beyond. Those working in the camp could not be embarrassed into thinking of the deeds that they were doing.
I'll ask some questions about Eva now, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah.
I remember my last meeting with you, of course. We were sitting in the restaurant of the Holiday Inn, and Eva said she wanted to speak to me. And you know, very often in Eva's films, I play the protagonist because I did not agree with Eva's theory of forgiveness, and I'm a little bit tougher and hard-hearted than Eva, and I'm always prepared to forgive someone who has repented of what they've done, meaning that they've admitted their crime, they've confessed to it, and they've made a determination they're not going to do it in the future. So when Eva wanted to talk to me, I wondered what she wanted to talk to me about. And she really wanted to talk to me about getting the opportunity to read a speech on the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. And she handed me the speech. And then I learned that 2 days later, really 18 hours later, she died. And I felt that this was her legacy. So I carried the speech in my briefcase, and I didn't dare open it. And then when I was asked to speak at the memorial service for Eva, knowing Eva, after I said what I had to say, I thought Eva should be given the final word. So I read her speech only for the first time at a memorial service in her honor.
What made Eva different?
I would say Eva was not different from other survivors, she just was so on steroids. Meaning that other survivors are tough, Eva was tough. One didn't survive if that one didn't have a certain toughness. One didn't survive if one didn't have a certain determination. And one didn't survive if someone didn't have the force of nature. Now, Eva had all of that in extreme. This was one tough woman. Nobody could stand in her way, and she was irresistible because she would run you right over if you stood in her way. She was determined, she was fierce, she was passionate. But most of all, she was determined to remember. But most of all, she was determined to remember. And in that sense, even though I opposed her ideologically and philosophically, she and I were comrades. And for a very long time, I wore the bracelet on my right arm, which said, WWED. What would Eva do? And I use that as a moral reminder, not to slacken, not to lessen, but to go forward with strength and integrity. As someone who bore witness with integrity, with passion, and with the fierceness of determination.